My name is Zeno. Today I'm going to present the paper of fuzzing configurations of program options. This work is done by me, George Klee, Eric Wang, Michael Hicks, and Shi Yiwei. The real-world programs are often come with configurations that turns on and off certain functionalities. Usually, when we are fuzzing them, what we do is we focus on a certain configuration and find bugs in that. However, doing this may miss the opportunity of the bugs that locates under other configurations. A simple remediation to this issue is to just fuzz all configurations of a program. This is usually impractical because usually the configuration space of real programs are pretty large. Another approach that's commonly used in the testing literature is to take samples of configurations. Without the prior knowledge of the configurations, of how the configurations affect the fuzzing performance, we actually can only allocate equal resources on each configuration, which may lead to a waste of resources. This motivates us to do an empirical study, trying to find out how configurations affect the fuzzing performance. Based on the observations of the empirical study, we developed ConfigFuzz. In ConfigFuzz, we expand the program input to include the configurations in it, and we allow the fuzzers to mutate this expanded input so that it smartly allocates resources for different configurations. In the preliminary evaluation experiments, we compared our ConfigFuzz to two baseline experiments. First, by fuzzing the default option of a program, and second, by fuzzing some sample options of a program. So on the empirical study, the question we're interested in is how configurations affect the fuzzing performance. In this experiment, we run the fuzzfl on 3 target programs, and we run 3 fuzzing trials on each configuration of each program. And these configuration spaces of the programs are manually constructed. We report the line coverage of the experimental result. This table shows the result for program FMPEG. On the first row, we have the number of lines covered by each single configuration. And for the program FMPEG, the configuration space is constructed as follows. We first include the default configuration of FMPEG, where we just do not specify any command line option. And we include 5 settings of the option -f. This -f option in FMPEG basically specifies the input or output format of the program. So these 6 configurations becomes our configuration space. In the first row in the table, we report the total number of lines covered by each configuration. From this row, we can see that the numbers varies differently, and the default option or default configuration, it takes the most lines of code covered. However, if we compare it with the aggregated results of all the configurations, it only accounts for 65%. On the second row, we report the number of lines covered by each option that are unique to other configurations. From line 2, we can see that every configuration in FMPEG has some unique lines covered, and under some configurations, the numbers are pretty large. The next table shows the experimental result of program NM. From this result, we can observe that, firstly, the number of lines covered by each configuration does not differ that much as FMPEG. And secondly, even though we have all but one configuration that has some unique lines covered, the numbers are pretty small for each configuration. So from this empirical study, our observation is that different configurations reach unique code locations, and different configurations contribute differently to fuzzing performance. These two observations also depend on programs. And it is actually important from this observation to smartly allocate resources for different configurations during fuzzing. Based on these observations, we developed ConfigFuzz. The key idea of the ConfigFuzz is that we expand the program input with configurations encoded in it, and we use the fuzzer to smartly fuzz the expanded input with the fuzzer's feedback loop. This is the overview of the workflow of ConfigFuzz. Firstly, it takes two inputs, a program and its configuration documentation. With this two input, we manually construct a configuration grammar out of it, which specifies how we encode the configurations into the program input. The encoding happens in a configuration stub, which is injected at the beginning of a program's main function. And by doing this, ConfigFuzz produces a program or transforms program with fuzzable input. When we use the fuzzer to fuzz this program, the fuzzable input is divided into two parts, the config bytes, where we encode the configurations, and the data bytes, where we hold the input data for fuzzing. The configuration stub we generated into the program's main function. Its functionality is to parse the fuzzable input into command line options and input data. The program execution will take this configuration and input data to execute, and when fuzzing executed, it will have some knowledge of the coverage, which guides the fuzzing of the expanded input. So the configuration grammar tells us how to encode configurations into the expanded input. On the right is an example configuration grammar from program FmpEg. Firstly, in the grammar, we identified 4 types of command line options. Different types of options will be encoded differently into the configuration stub. For example, the -f option in FmpEg is a choice option, where when we specify -f, we need to follow a setting that is a choice from a list. In the grammar file, we also specify how the program takes the input file. In FmpEg, we use a flag -i to take it. And there's a field in the grammar called maxOps, which specifies the number of options or the max number of options in ConfigFuzz when we are constructing configurations. While the configuration grammar tells us how we encode the configurations into the input, the expanded input organization tells us where to encode those configurations. With the input data, we divide it into 2 parts, configuration bytes and data bytes. And in the configuration bytes, we first have a few option bytes. Each option byte represents an option in a configuration. Following that, groups of setting bytes. Each group of setting bytes represent the setting of an option in the program. So number of groups of the setting bytes is decided by the number of options in the program. Here comes the encoding of the configurations. On the right is the same example grammar file from FmpEg. And in the configuration stub, when we are encoding these configurations, what we do first is to read in the option bytes. Here, as we have explicitly said, explicitly see that we have at most 2 options generated in a configuration. So we first read into 2 option bytes. Following that are 4 groups of setting bytes, as we have 4 options in the grammar. The remaining data is used as data bytes, which is the actual data for the program. We use a mode approach for option byte to decide which option it represents. So basically, we convert the option byte to a number, take a mode of the number of options, and calculate a option ID. With that option ID, we can look into the configuration grammar for the corresponding option. For example, if the calculated ID is 0, when we look into the grammar, we found that it represents option -f. After the option is decided, we append it to argv. And with the option ID, we actually know which setting bytes that option represents. So here, with option ID 0, we know this setting bytes is the settings for option -f. We use the similar mode approach to decide which setting it represents. And for example, we have mpeg as a calculation result. When setting bytes is decided, we also append it to the argv. After we have processed all the option bytes, we will lastly append the data bytes as the last. So by doing this, by modifying this argv, we are mimicking the situation where we specify the command line input, command line options through the command line, and let the program take the file as input. So to figure out how effective ConfigFuzz is, we did a preliminary evaluation experiment. We explored with 2 settings of ConfigFuzz. So we specified there are at most 1 and 2 explicitly set options in ConfigFuzz, and we call the settings ConfigFuzz1 and ConfigFuzz2. We run 2 fuzzers, FL and FL++, with ConfigFuzz on 3 target programs. We removed the string options from the configuration grammar, as in one of our baselines, we use the sample approach, and sampling from the unbounded strings is just impractical. So there are 2 baselines we compare ConfigFuzz with. First is called baseline diff, where we use the default configuration of the program, and second is baseline conf, where we take sample of configurations generated by 2 recovery arrays, and we allocate equal time for each sample. So the property of 2 recovery array is shown on this table. And on this table, I took, for simplicity, 4 Boolean options from CX field. So with a 2 recurring array, each pair of option settings will appear at least in 1 sample configuration. So this is the reason why we use the covering array as a sample approach for one of our baselines. So there are 2 questions we are interested in on this evaluation experiment. First is, does ConfigFuzz outperform the 2 baselines? And second, how ConfigFuzz1 and ConfigFuzz2 compare? Remember, ConfigFuzz K basically means we specify at most key options in a configuration. We present our preliminary results by the coverage growth plots. In this plot, the x-axis is time marked in seconds, and y-axis is the line coverage of each setup. From these 2 graphs, first observation is the ConfigFuzz marked in red and blue outperform the 2 baselines marked in black and green. So we can see that within these 2 fuzzers, ConfigFuzz covered at least 10,000 lines of code, while the baseline covers at most 6,000. The second observation we have from this experimental result is that ConfigFuzz 2 outperforms ConfigFuzz 1. So we are getting more coverage when we allow two options interactions in the configuration. The difference is 2,000 lines of code in FL and 1,000 lines in FL++. On the second program, the experimental result is actually different. So firstly, we found that the line in green, where is the baseline experiment generated by two recurring array, performed the best. And the comparison between ConfigFuzz 1 and ConfigFuzz 2 is different among the two fuzzers. The difference is small, only several hundred lines of code, and the results did not show statistical significance. So this motivates us for a deeper investigation on the result, because currently with our idea of the ConfigFuzz, we don't clearly know what causes this observation of the result on sixth field. So what we plan to do is to perform a deeper investigation of those results. For example, we want to figure out which configurations are fuzzed over time. How many times the configurations has changed during fuzzing, and how the configurations contribute to the fuzzing performance. In the future experiments, we would also like to evaluate ConfigFuzz with more programs as fuzzers. And we also want to experiment with other variants of ConfigFuzz. For example, we want to increase the degree of interaction between options by allowing more options to appear in one configuration. And we want to see how configuration performs with a string option turned on. Because in the evaluation, we turned off the string option because we are using some sampling approach for baseline. So in conclusion, in this paper, we first did an empirical study. We found that configurations cover unique lines of code during fuzzing, and they contribute to code coverage differently. Based on this, we designed ConfigFuzz, which encodes the configurations into the expanded input of a program, so that the fuzzer can smartly fuzz configurations with its coverage feedback loop. We did a preliminary evaluation experiment, and based on the results, we found we need to do deeper investigation to get insights from them. So this is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.